When you think about Acts 14, when Paul is speaking in Iconium, when he says, he's the creator of heaven and earth, and he has not left himself without a witness in every culture. And I think maybe some people, some missionaries, or some, Western people who thought, who were bringing the gospel, might have needed to think about that the place where they are going is not a place where God has not been.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That the missionary is not bringing God to Africa. God is bringing the missionary to Africa. I think that's something that tends to be forgotten. And if God has been in Africa already, and we know God is active, the missionaries question, the first question they need to ask themselves is, what has he been doing there?
Well, thank you for watching another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Lisa Fields, the founder of the Jude 3 Project, and I'm so excited for today's guest, Dr. Joseph Byamukama. I'm sorry. I know I'm saying it wrong. I'll let you
No,
pronounce
no, no,
it
no, no.
right.
That's a good try.
Well, tell our audience a little bit about who you are.
So I'm Joseph Byamukama, grown up, grew up in Kampala, Uganda, was born here, married to Daphne Byamukama. We have two boys. One is 6, the other is 3. Quite energetic boys. I'm the founder and team leader for Veracity Found, a ministry and an organization that seeks to resource the Ugandan church through contextual theological resources and research. We do exegetical studies. We do seminars, church history seminars. But I also recently led a team that planted one of the newer church plants in Kampala called the Found Church. We are just now, 7 to 8 months into it. It's
Okay.
quite great work, but also busy. It's beautiful. So that's a little bit about me. I do definitely have, as you might have mentioned earlier, I do have a doctorate in New Testament studies from Ridley College. That's Melbourne, Australia. And my studies was in how the book of Isaiah shapes Luke's portrayal of Jesus as Lord in the
Mhm.
book of Acts. I love how the New Testament uses the Old Testament. So that's a bit about me for now.
That's awesome. So we got a New Testament scholar. I told you that we had Hakeem on. I don't know if your episode will come on before his or not, but Hakeem Bradley, who is also at the same school, he's focusing on James. You're focusing on
Yes,
Isaiah and Luke. So
in Acts.
that's awesome. That connection, and I'm excited to have you on because I got this book, um, Apologetics in Africa, some time ago, and we had Kevin on, who was the editor. But I read your chapter on Christianity and the African traditional gods, and I thought it was one of the best treatments that I've seen on the conversation. And so I was like, I got to get him on the podcast. So thank you for accepting the invitation. Um,
No, thank you for the opportunity.
yeah. So let's dive in. When you think about Christianity and African traditional gods, or when you think about just the West understanding African
Mhm.
traditional gods, what are some misconceptions that you think are are important for us to highlight in the beginning of this
You mean
conversation?
how the West understands African Christianity?
African traditional gods.
African tradition or religious. So there are quite many, but I suspect one of those would be how there might be an assumption that Christianity brings a strange new god to the African continent. Of course, most people tend to think, and maybe they have some justifications in one way or another, but they tend to think that Africans were traditionally just animists who lacked knowledge of the one true God. And
Mhm.
I think that's a misconception that has its own consequences. One of which then means that even the missionaries might not have had as much reception as they could have had they actually understood the African consciousness, especially with regard to the understanding of God and the supreme being. So the idea that the God that Christianity proclaims is foreign to the African soil is one of those misconceptions. There would be the others that would, for example, also have to do with, and so the way even they think about the African gods, the failure to know that even in the minds of many Africans, there are rankings or levels, in the sense that the Africans did not really believe that there are many gods at the same level, but they uh, understood quite, I think, remarkably, that there is one supreme being, one supreme creator. So the second misconception would be, when they think about African spirituality, most people think probably these are many gods that are competing for supreme status or supreme importance, even in the African consciousness, rather than actually thinking that traditionally Africans had always held to a supreme being, and they will call him by various names. From the tribe where I come from, we would call him Ruhanga, and where I am in Kampala, they would call him Katonda. And different African tribes and cultures would have him named differently, but this supreme being is really supreme. He's not at the same level with the other gods of the rivers or mountains, or fertility or stuff like that. And so most people tend to assume that perhaps, even though there might be a consciousness of God, uh, there is a competition, sort of like a pantheon, and there is a competition between the gods. But I think in many traditional African cultures, there existed an understanding that there is actually one supreme creator who is unrivaled, even though there might be other gods that may be personifications or manifestations of this one god, or even assistants in that sense, also almost like angelic powers.
Yeah, no, that's really, I think, helpful to understand, because when we think of African traditional religions, we often think of polytheism, and
Hmm.
you're talking in this chapter about really understanding African spiritual religions in some aspects of monotheism, because
Hmm.
there is an understanding of a supreme God, and then there's a concept in which we in the understanding that there was once um communion between God and humanity, but something happened, similar
Yeah,
to the story in Genesis, um
yeah,
that created this chasm. And so
yeah.
the African understanding is that we cannot be close to God, or to be close to God is dangerous. I thought that was fascinating. Can
Hmm.
you talk about that a little bit more?
Yes, so it's I think one of the great African theology or theologians or scholars would have been John Samuel Mbiti.
Mhm.
Some of your viewers might know of him, and he does survey the concepts of God, or the concept of gods in Africa, and various communities, various cultures, various tribes have an understanding of course, the nearness of this supreme being from creation, but also an understanding that something wrong happened, and different cultures will explain differently what that something wrong it is. Some might say, a woman was, pounding grain, and the pounding stick hit God, and he's like, let me withdraw. Some others would say there was a command that God gave, and that was not followed by the first couple, and God withdrew. And so there are different explanations, but it's that sort of withdraw, that understanding that there is a supreme being, but the understanding that something went wrong that caused his withdrawal, that is quite prevalent in many African cultures. And because God withdrew because of the sin of, human sin, some cultures would tend to think of his nearness to be sort of like dangerous. And I think Mbiti does mention both, Burundi, and Rwanda, where they speak of the Imanambi, that sort of like the danger that the nearness of God does cause. And I think that relational gap, that relational distance, created an avenue where then intermediary gods begin to arise. Or mediators, I think is the language that the Bible could use, whether those be ancestors, whether those be deified natural phenomena, say they are spirits of rivers, spirits of mountains, and things like that, or whether they are deified gods, like the gods of war, the gods of fertility, the gods of, or earthquake, and all that. I think those come in the traditional African consciousness to really bridge that gap between the transcendent God who is removed from the day-to-day affairs of Africans because of sin, to bridge that gap between that God and themselves. I think that's in a sense what was understood largely in many African cultures, um, of God. His nearness is it brings judgment, and yet actually Africans yearned for the presence of the gods in the day-to-day life, because Africans have always known that you can't do life alone, and they have always been aware that there is a spiritual world that exists, and they have tried to live at good terms with that spiritual world, in various ways, whether it's appeasing to the spirits or sacrifices or things of that sort. But they have always tried to reach out to the other side in one way or another. Now, of course, we could discuss the dangers and maybe polytheism and stuff like that. But the African has always yearned for God, or at least the gods. As some might say, traditional Africans are notoriously religious.
Mhm. How many traditional African religions are there? Because I think it gets lumped all in one. So when people say
Yeah.
African spirituality, they're thinking one thing. Recently, we had a former Hindu monk on, and he was explaining the variety of Hindu religions, and
Mhm.
it was a paradigm shift because so many people think of Hinduism as one thing, and I think similarly
Yeah.
with African spiritual religions, it's all lumped into one when there's a variety.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's a difficult question, because in a sense, so there is the basic infrastructure, the common understanding of the gods or God, and yet that commonality, for example, for who the supreme being is and the other gods, does tend to play out in different ways, in different contexts, in different cultures. And so that even getting to know how many spiritualities are there is quite hard. I would assume there would be as many as the cultures there are, but even within cultures, you could argue that there are different spiritualities depending on on what God is being devoted. So you think about even in the Greco-Roman world, where families would have their family altars and their family gods in that sense, and each of those family gods would ask for different things, different uh, ways and expressions of obedience. I would think you could say the same for the African traditional religions, in that sense. But as I mentioned, there tends to be a common theme or a common thread through all those spiritualities or all those religions, even within the African context, especially again as united by and large by the commonality of the belief in the one supreme creator, united as well by the fear of death, because that's one thing that is quite was very very real for the traditional African. Death was quite near, and you can traverse various cultures, even growing up, because some of these things sometimes can be discussed as though they are quite archaic, sort of like long time ago. We are just they are relics, but some of us who grew up in villages or up country in places in Uganda, we actually experienced some of these rituals, and in many other places those rituals are still very much existent. And so there are threads that cut across, but also there are distinctiveness about each culture or each family or each tribe, and in how they worship the sort of God that they do traditionally worshipped. Now, of course, some of that is has been confronted, so to speak, with Christianity, but I guess that's a conversation we also have later.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. When we think about, there's two things that we hear a lot, and sometimes we don't have proper definitions for it.
Yeah.
One is Urubus and um, Orisha. We hear it a lot, especially because there's this um, uh, in the U.S. in the West, a lot of black
Hmm.
Christian, a lot not black Christians, a lot of black young people are moving into African spirituality, because they
Mm.
feel Christianity is oppressive, and the white man's
Mm.
religion. And so there's
Mm-hmm.
this new interest in African spirituality by a number of people. And so people can hear things like Yorubas or Orisha and not know the definitions. So can you just
Yeah.
explain? So there's been this, obviously there's been this gap because of someone seeing based in African traditional religious ideology,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's
Mm-hmm.
gap fillers. Can you
Mm-hmm.
explain those gap fillers and then go into the definitions of like Yoruba and Orisha?
Yeah, so Yoruba would be, I think, a tribe in Nigeria, and in a way they would, so they would, like every African culture and every, every tribe, they would have different, sort of like distinct understandings of who God is,
Hmm.
and Orisa would be one of those, that would be, it's a Yoruba word. Some so would say Orisa Agbaye, and I think that's Jacob K. Olupona who would define that to really be both the God of the universe and the universal God, in the sense that, again, the traditional understanding of the God who created all things is that he's not restricted geographically.
Hmm.
Like he's the same God in India, the same God in Kampala, named differently, but he is not restricted by geographical boundaries, not even restricted by ethnic, differences as such. And so, Orisa Agbai would be that sort of universal God, but also God of the universe. Again, communicating the same sense that he's the creator of all things there are. But there are some that would also speak of Orisa to actually mean the pantheon, so to speak, or the legion of the gods that there are. And maybe that's what you are getting to,
Yes.
the fact that that transcendence of God, at least as we conceived it traditionally in Africa, created also a relational gap, and consequently then the legions or the different gods begin to occupy that sort of gap. And so in the day-to-day life, if you're barren, for example, you're infertile and you need a child, to who do you go to? Most traditional Africans would not go to the supreme creator because he's removed from their lives, and they may not even know of his benevolence towards us in that regard. And so they will go to the god of fertility. If you have grown crops and it's rainy season traditionally, but it so happens that it's very dry and your crops are dying, who do you go to? In Uganda, here where we are as well, there was the god for Musisi, the god for earthquake. And so usually you find, people named Musisi in even Kampala and Uganda, and those are children that have been born during an earthquake or something of that sort. And there used to be a fear that the god of the underworld, when he shakes, the world, that's when the earthquake comes, and it can create miscarriages or something of that sort. So if you want to protect your child, from miscarriage, who do you pray to? And so those sort of like gods they came in quite handy, in the sense that the Africans needed someone or some spiritual entity to relate with on the day-to-day challenges of life. And they did not think that the transcendent God, the supreme being, was near enough in that sense. And so I think that's what creates the deified humans or deified natural phenomena. And again, these could be as many as legion, or Orisa in that sense.
Yeah, no, that's helpful because when people think of legion, they think of is it in Acts when it
Yeah, yeah. Yes, in the Gospels, when Jesus is, casting out
yeah,
demons, and
yeah, the
and he
Gospels, I'm
says,
sorry.
"Who are you?" And he says, "We are legion. We are many."
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And so I think, leading to that, there's this automatic assumption that everything African spiritual is demonic.
yeah,
Can you address that? Uh how that ideology comes, and I again, I think
yeah.
that is helpful because I think, we don't demonize Greek mythology in the way we demonize African spirituality. Like we talk about
No, we
Zeus
don't.
and we talk about Hercules in ways that we don't
Hmm.
talk about the supreme being and the gods, the lesser gods
Yes.
that are African spirituality. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Now, I definitely there are things to look at critically within the African spirituality, but I think you're definitely right in the sense that when missionaries came, but especially when colonialists came too, there was this sensibility of everything African is demonic, everything African is evil, and in a sense, there is a glorification of that which is Western.
Hmm.
And it's, I think, very, very tragic. And it may account to what you mentioned earlier that there are many Africans or many Africans in the diaspora or of African descent, people of African descent who are going back to the traditional spirituality of the Africans and who see Christianity as a colonial religion. Now, of course, I would say that's not the case, but I would understand where they are coming from. So the fact that, so you read even the Old Testament. So one of the texts that I love most is when Genesis 28, when Jacob is running away from his brother Esau and headed to his uncle Laban, and he sleeps at Bethel, and he uses a stone as his pillow. Fascinating too, but he dreams. There is a ladder that is connecting heaven and earth, and on the top of the ladder the Lord is there, and then he wakes up in the morning and he says, the Lord is in this place, and yet I knew it not. And of course, that connects quite well with the rest of biblical witness. When you think about Acts 17, the altar to the unknown God. When you think about Acts 14, when Paul is speaking in Iconium, when he says, he's the creator of heaven and earth, and he has not left himself without a witness in every culture. And I think maybe some people, some missionaries, or some Western people who thought who were bringing the gospel might have needed to think about that the place where they are going is not a place where God has not been,
Hmm.
right? That the missionary is not bringing God to Africa. God is bringing the missionary to Africa. I think that's something that tends to be forgotten. And if God has been in Africa already, and we know God is active, the missionaries question, the first question they need to ask themselves is, what has he been doing there?
Hmm.
Unless they want to assume that he has been there passive and doing nothing. In what ways has he been preparing the way for the coming of the gospel? Because I think there are many ways that he has been doing so. Now, again, we will talk about the various, things that the gospel and Christianity would critique and confront. But I think the place to begin would be to acknowledge. I mean, one of those is what we've talked about already: the belief in the existence of the supreme being, the fact that the whole universe is God's a theater, it's God's artwork. So God has been there. The fact that God has been named in Africa. That's why when when there are Bible translations to different languages in Africa, they don't struggle with the name of God because God has been there. God has been named. And I could wish that many missionaries had probably leaned more into that, understood the things that the gospel confirms about African sensibilities and African spirituality, and then moved probably to see the things that the gospel would clarify and then the things that the gospel confronts. But I think to some extent they might have lumped all that together. And I think by doing so, they might have lost the opportunity to have the gospel really reach deep, deep into the heart of every African and bring about total transformation as such. One of those areas would be, for example, I mentioned earlier our fear of death, the fact that we fear death. We still do, but the African, fear of death led the African to do quite many things, whether it's a sacrifice, whether it's even polygamy. Most people may not acknowledge or notice the connection between the fear of death and polygamy, because if you're in a culture context or in a place or at a time in history where you have many children dying, but also where you don't have a vision of the afterlife, the vision of the resurrection in that sense, where you will be raised from the dead, where your understanding of your identity is tied to memory, who remembers you among the living. So in Uganda, where I am, when there is a phrase "tamblango Muganda," walk like a Muganda, literally, if you were to translate it that way. But what they mean by that, they don't mean literal walking. They mean, when I ask you "tamblango Muganda," you tell me your ancestry. You say, I'm so and so, son of so and so, grandson of so and so from such and such a place. And that was a mechanism for people to be remembered even when they die. But the idea is that as long as there are people who remember you when you're dead, you do not move on from, you don't lose your identity beyond the grave. But if the last person who knows you passes on, then you dissolve into this mass of spirits, so to speak, that is undifferentiated, that is impersonal in that sense. And so to mitigate against that, you give birth to as many children. And of course, one of the easiest way to do that is to marry as many women as you can. But those are things that are tied together that I would wish that the missionaries could have capitalized on, even rather than just saying, now that you've become a Christian, you need to do away with your other wife or something of that sort. But to understand actually what is at the heart of that, the fear of death and the lack of hope for the resurrection, and communicate the fact that actually our personhood, our identity, human identity, does not dissolve at death, but rather in Christ we live. And so I think the dismissing of the whole African spirituality without actually studying it, listening to the cries, listening to the hopes, listening to the fears, listening to the expectations of the Africans, to see how actually the gospel of Christ communicates hope to Africans, I think was one of the mistakes, I would say, that accompanied even, and I don't think that every missionary did that, but I think there are some who leaned more into that. And I think partly the social Darwinism has something to do with that too. But I think you're right in the sense that many people might have demonized the whole African spirituality, entirely lumped it together without necessarily having to make distinctions as to what the Bible confirms, what the Bible clarifies, and what the Bible confronts.
Yeah, that's so fascinating, especially that the whole thing, but in particular that polygamy point. I never thought about it in that way. That is very helpful. Also a re that helps me reframe even my understanding, because I think you think, well, when you hear polygamy, especially polygamy is getting a resurgence in the conversations
Mhm.
in the US, right? So a lot of uh podcasts talk about it, and a lot of it has to do with, it's pleasure centered, right? To be able to have
Mhm.
multiple, and so the assumption is when you see it sometimes in other places, you think it's the same. You think it all looks kind of the same. Some of
Mhm.
it is financials,
Yeah.
but this whole idea, what you're speaking of, tied to African spirituality, is this idea of, what do you think about the afterlife? What is your eschatology? All of those things play into how you live now. Um,
Okay. Yeah.
and so when we think about the eschatology of African spirituality, the concept of heaven and hell, is that in any of African spiritualities or African religions?
Not that I would know.
Okay.
Not that I would know. In a sense, I think Mbiti does mention in his book, African religions and philosophy. He speaks about the fact as that Africans have always, the relationship that Africans have with time is that they tend to think of time not as something ahead, but something that is now and in the past.
Okay.
And so and we have a different, or at least traditionally we had a different relationship with time than, say, Western civilization. So that's why, partly that's why, and many people here might be, when you come from the West or you visit Africa, you might be frustrated with timekeeping.
Mm-hmm.
You set a plan and you're like, we're meeting at 10, and some people might come at 10:30 because of course they still think it's 10. But part of that is also because Africans have always related with time in terms of events. Time is meaningful because of events,
Mm-hmm.
and events tend to happen now
Mm-hmm.
or in the past. Usually we didn't think of events as in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's again why we Africans tried as much as they could to maximize the now.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, so that their understanding of the heaven and hell would not be existent in that sense. And of course, that could be also tied into the understanding of what mainly sin is. Of course, it has a vertical component, but Africans have always thought of sin mainly in the horizontal plane, how it affects interpersonal relationships,
Mm-hmm.
how it affects the rest of creation in that sense. And so there is not so much that concept of a judgment that is coming in the afterlife. that reckoning, it's not there. As I mentioned again, their desire to escape death was so that they do not disappear into the sort of like fluid, um, continuum of spirits where they are impersonal, where you can't be identified. In a sense, you dissolve. So they would think of death in that sense, like you've died physically, death has conquered you physically, and you're hoping that you can retain your spirituality in the underworld for as long as you can, or you can come back as an ancestor, depending on how important you were. But you're not going to a place where you will experience heaven or great blessings and a great resurrected body, or hell where there will be judgment, but you're going to a place where you're joining the rest of your ancestors, and you're joining them for as long as there is someone alive who remembers you. If the last person who remembers you also dies, then you actually go into that unconscious, mass of spirits where you are no longer known as Joseph, or as Lisa in that sense. And so no, I don't think Africans put great stress on that sort of afterlife. That's again the doctrine that Christianity does bring, that I think is really, really beautiful, that I think is quite redemptive, that I think puts, if understood well and if taught well, puts a lot of fears for Africans to rest. I mean, the way it plays out even now is the fear to die childless, right?
Mm.
You It might lurk underneath the subconscious. Sometimes people, even our people today, may not explain why they have that fear, or why parents are putting them on pressure to make sure they leave an heir. But that's again in the background, underneath, it's that fear of the fact that if you die without a child, if you don't leave anyone behind, you will disappear into oblivion. You will not be remembered. You will not exist beyond the grave. So I think for me, the doctrine of the resurrection is one of the most beautiful, teachings that Christianity brought on this continent.
That's so helpful. When we think about ancestors and the role they play in life now, so the idea of people praying to the ancestors, it is this idea of the ancestors acting as an intermediary, essentially,
Mm.
because you can't have access to the supreme God
Yes.
in their understanding of God. And so we would see what Jesus is for Christians, the ancestors play a
Yeah.
part for them. For
Yeah.
those who embrace, or their faith is African um, traditional religions. And so I think that's helpful for understanding. And then also that piece, I think, is really crucial, of understanding
Yeah.
your legacy. Your legacy keeps you alive
Mhm.
even after you die, essentially.
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
if you don't have a legacy, you go off into oblivion. And I think that's helpful to even understand the ideology, and how we can, as you say, bridge the gap with thinking about the resurrection. One of the things I
Yeah.
want to
Yeah.
address, we've covered so much that I think has been extremely helpful. One of the most, I think, helpful understandings, because when I have a book I wrote, When Faith Disappoints, and it's all, the focus is understanding the pain points underneath people's intellectual questions about faith. And I love this
Mm.
conversation because I think it's getting at the root of some of the things. Because when we think about all the conversations that I hear often about African spirituality, it's like, don't touch
Mm.
anything over there, is demonic. You'll get a spirit, and then you'll have to fight it off in spiritual warfare. And what I'm saying, cast out
Yeah.
demons. And again, all of
Yes.
that,
Yes.
I think there's an aspect of that plays a part in some spaces, but that's not the whole of the
Hmm.
conversation. And so I'm thankful that we're having this conversation. When we talk about witchcraft, or things of that nature, or the demonic or occult in African
Hmm.
spiritual religions, because I know there's this idea of, when I opened up one of my chapters talking about, there was another apologist that worked for RZIM in Nigeria. I can't Justice. Do you know
Hmm.
Justice?
No,
Okay.
I knew Gideon Odoma, but not Justice.
Okay, so Justice was on. I had a conversation with him years ago, and I was asking him one of the
Mm.
challenges in Nigeria around Christians. like, what are the apologetic challenges? And he said that many, when people convert, the challenges, they go back into African traditional religions when certain problems arise and they feel like prayer doesn't solve
Mhm.
them. So they might go back and go to someone that could cure their child or something like that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
the insufficiency in their minds of Christianity when they've seen other methods work for healing
Mhm.
and things of that nature.
Mhm.
Can you speak
Mhm.
to that a little
Mhm.
bit? Because I think that's important.
Yes. Yes. No, thank you. It's definitely true that witchcraft is a concern, you could say, and across Africa, really, by and large, especially sub-Saharan Africa. I've written quite a few pieces for the Gospel Coalition Africa on witchcraft and generational curses too, and we do encounter those, those issues even here. And you're right that people would it's not unheard of or uncommon for someone to be in church on Sunday and they visit a shrine on Wednesday.
Hmm.
It's not uncommon here. Partly, and I would say that one of the major issues is the lack of appreciation or understanding of God's sovereignty or God's power over all, but also the aspect that, in a way, Africans, and that's getting to the things that Christianity corrects, right, and confronts. We traditionally related with the gods transactionally.
Hmm.
We did not relate with them for their own sake. So the idea of love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength is not something that we really had taken keen note of. But we went to the gods when we had problems. We went to the gods when we wanted things. And the gods sort of like also related with us in the sort of, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Sort of like the same things we find in Greco-Roman mythology, where there can be some gods that are quite vindictive of, cruel or something like that, but they are transactional in a sense. And so if again I need rain for my crops, I go to the witch doctor, and the witch doctor tells me the things that I need to do. You bring a white goat, maybe, or a white chicken, and maybe this, or you might need to take this charm and bury it in your field, so there are ways in which we would invoke the gods, but for our own good. Yeah, but no, so we do, even when we come to faith, we tend to treat the pastor as we treated the witch doctor traditionally. This is what I mean. We come to him. We assume he knows God on our behalf, just like the witch doctor knew God on our behalf. We don't need to do the hard work of Bible interpretation, of getting to find out the will of God for ourselves, or praying, or things of that sort. We go to him. He tells us your problem is a result of A, B, C, and D, and this is what you need to do: A, B, C, and D, and you just need to leave some offering or some seed money, as some would call it. And so that sort of same transactional mindset that we had in the African traditional mind, understanding of the gods is transferred to Christianity. But again, back to your point, the fact that the clamor to return to the African traditional spirituality means that there is a resurgence in witchcraft too, because we love the gods that we can manipulate, and gods that can give us a great step ahead or an advantage even over our competitor or our neighbor. People used to do that traditionally. Whether you want more children than your core wife, or you need more riches than your neighbor and competitor, or anything of that sort. And so the gods that can be, in a sense, manipulated in that sense, are on the rise as well. And so, yes, there is that, a resurgence of witchcraft. Now, of course, one of the things I mentioned, the fact that we also don't have a good understanding of the doctrine of suffering. I think most of our churches could do a better job in helping people understand that, one, the fact that suffering is not the end of you. It's a reality in life. Of course, it comes into the world, especially because of sin, but also that God can use suffering redemptively. and that as a Christian you can see that supremely on the cross. So most of us and my peers and you know and many African young people, they have this idea that if you suffer, you have fallen out of favor with God, and so they don't know how to have a life shaped by pain, a life shaped by suffering, a life that is transformed in such a way that appreciates joy, appreciates life, but also grows an empathetic heart towards those who suffer around us. We don't see suffering redemptively, and as a result, when I pray to God 3 times, remove the thorn from my side, and the thorn doesn't go, I do not think that his grace is sufficient for me and that his power is made perfect in my weakness. The default thinking is maybe I need to go to the gods that can hear because I need this thorn removed like now. And so I think the need for us to have, and by us I mean within the African church, to have a very good conversation concerning what it means to follow a suffering Savior, what it means to actually surrender to a God who transforms pain and suffering and uses it for our good and draws us to a knowledge of Him, a love for Him, and draws us to value things that nothing in this world can take away, things that no moth, no rat, no thief can steal or take away. I think that's a conversation that we need to continue having on the African continent, because if we don't, then suffering will keep driving people away from the gospel and onto the arms of either witch doctors or even Pan-African anti-theists or atheists in that regard. And so I think, yeah, you're right that witchcraft is appealing, but I think as a church the gospel does present good tools and good responses to that. And maybe lastly, to touch on the fact that the reminder to remind people, to remind Africans, to remind Christians that actually God does protect us even against witchcraft, because there are many who are afraid. Maybe my neighbor bewitched me. Maybe the reason why I can't succeed in life is because someone just went to the witch doctor. Maybe I the reason why I don't have this good job is because of witchcraft. And so there are those fears that are still quite pertinent in Africa. But just to help many people appreciate and recognize that actually, no, you serve a God who has triumphed over principalities and powers, and that actually you are in Him, and there is nothing that would separate you from Him. And so, if there is something that you don't have, you can pray. But if you pray earnestly and He does not give it, it's not because He hasn't heard you, it's not because there are powers that have taken it away from you, but rather it's actually because it is in God's will to keep you where you are as He grows you into the kind of a person He wants you to be. So it's that sort of understanding that God has triumphed over the principalities and powers that we fear, and that we are seated with Him, and that there is no powers that can actually do harm unto us unless the Lord has permitted it.
Mhm. Last question I'll ask you, and I think it's helpful. Do all people in African religions practice witchcraft?
I don't think so. It's not all. So growing up, again I grew up. By the end of this, maybe people might begin guessing which village I grew up in. But no, I did experience those sort of like practices. One of my moms used to, actually, she had a shrine, and the irony was, so she was Roman Catholic. The irony was she would have a rosary and a Bible on this side, and then she would sacrifice and pray to her gods on the other. And we had neighbors who practiced witchcraft, but not all Africans practice that. um, and especially with the coming of Christianity, I think that those practices have tremendously gone down. But did all of them have an awareness that witchcraft is real? Yes, they did.
Mhm.
They really did have the understanding that there is real evil at work. There are real witches, and witchcraft is real. And I suspect in the sort of like Western civilization, especially that is influenced by Enlightenment, I understand the temptation to disbelieve in those sort of stories and maybe relegate them to but of course there is Salem in Massachusetts. I tend to forget
Mhm.
which which is, but yeah, there can be a sense of thinking that maybe those are just stories, those are just myth, that there is nothing like witchcraft. But Africans have always known that witchcraft was real. They had always seen the results of that too. But not every African participated or practiced it as such.
This I said that was the last question, but I do have a question that I think is helpful because there's been a lot of conversations in the uh in the Christian space recently about what is a witch. Like, can you define witch and witchcraft, uh, warlock, to give some context? Because I think sometimes we throw around words and we don't fully
Yeah.
know the meaning. So I just want context from African spiritual kind of understanding of witches and witchcraft.
Yeah, no. So I would think of witchcraft really as an attempt to manipulate the gods or the powers, this spiritual powers, for the ill or for the disadvantage or for to the detriment of someone
Okay.
else. And so, if I conjure up magic or something of that sort with the intent and purpose to harm or hurt someone else, I think that's how I would define witchcraft. It would be different in a sense from just in quotes what we used to hear as magic for attractive purposes, where you just want to gather a following, although that can itself have some harmful purposes. But witchcraft is when there is another entity, a spiritual entity involved, and being involved for the express purpose of harming or hurting someone else.
And when you define witch, would it be
Yeah.
the mediator
No,
for which
I suspect
the mediator for
I
which?
suspect the which then would be someone who engages that sort of power, the other worldly power, with an either for their own sake or on behalf of someone else to bring harm or hurt to an individual.
Okay. No, that's helpful. How can people get in contact with you? I know you said you've written blogs. Um, I want everybody to get
Yes.
this book, Apologetics in Africa. Uh, what camera
Yeah.
am I looking at? This Apologetics in Africa here. Um,
Yeah.
because I think it's helpful, not just your chapter, but it's one of the most helpful resources apologetically that I've um, that I've came across, especially for people, Black people. And so I think
Yeah.
it's one of the most helpful um, treatments with so many different scholarly contributions. Um,
Mm.
and so I think it's a wonderful resource that people should get. And your chapter is phenomenal. How can
No, thank you.
people outside of this book um, get
Mhm.
the articles you wrote? I know you said it's on the Gospel Coalition's website.
Yeah, the Gospel Coalition Africa, so they can find them there. But as well, they could shoot me an email.
Okay.
Um, you can give them my email
And what's your web?
with
You have a
express
website,
permission.
right?
Yes, my blog, you mean?
Yeah.
That's just byamukama.com. So my last name, Byamukama, then .com.
Okay. So is it Joseph, your
Yeah.
last name.com? Or just your
Yeah,
last?
byamukama.com.
Okay.
Just my last
Okay.
name.com.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Are you on social media at all?
I am. I'm on X. I haven't gotten to that place of calling it X. I still call it Twitter.
Okay.
But
Okay.
I'm on X with the handle Nkajunwa. That's Nkajunwa. Nkajunwa. And I'm on Facebook as well. Byamukama Joseph. Yeah, I'm on social media.
Awesome, Joseph. This has been a rich time. I've learned a lot. And I
Thank you.
feel enlightened. So thank you for your hardworking contribution to these resources and the resources you're creating. Thank y'all all for watching another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, you can catch all our past episodes on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Jew3project. You listen wherever you stream your favorite podcast. We could not do what we do without generous support from people like you. So consider being a monthly donor at Jew3project.org, hitting that donate tab. All our resources, merch, curriculum, online courses, all the things are on our website. So definitely check that out. Remember to get my book, When Faith Disappoints, wherever books are sold. And until next time, grace and peace and God bless.